Hello, I'm Rick Sinding. It's Tuesday, October 2nd, 2018, here at the Eagleton Institute of Politics on the campus of Rutgers University. With me today for the Center on the American Governor is Heather Howard, who has served in a variety of governmental positions at both the state and federal levels and in both the executive and legislative branches. Her legislative experience includes service as Chief of Staff to then U.S. Senator John Corzine, who subsequently became New Jersey's 54th governor in 2006. At that point, Heather became first the chief policy advisor to Governor Corzine and subsequently served as the state commissioner of the Department of Health and Senior Services. Heather, welcome to Eagleton.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks for having me.
Let's begin by getting to know you a little bit. Tell us a little bit about your background. Where did you grow up? Where did you go to school? What did you study? How did you get into politics and public affairs?
So I'm actually not from New Jersey. I'm from New York, Westchester County, Scarsdale. And I went to Duke for undergrad. And then as soon as I got out of undergrad, I started to work for my congresswoman. And I was really fortunate that she was somebody really terrific, Nita Lowey. Now, at the time, it was only her second term in Congress. But people may know her now. She's the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee. She's a very senior member of Congress now. So I just was very fortunate to start on the ground level. I was a staff assistant, but I was really bitten by the politics and policy bug. It was really fun. That's a great place to be, a young person in Washington working on the Hill. And
how did you just jump into that? How did you get a job in a congresswoman's office?
She was my congresswoman, and I wrote her, and I said I'd like to work, and they said, will you be a staff assistant? Which is basically the receptionist. So I was answering the phone. I used to answer the phone at home, Congresswoman Lowey's office, thinking I was at work. But it was a great way to get exposed because you would hear the constituent complaints, meet everybody who came in. And then, of course, I grew within the office, and she was a great mentor, but I was really, really lucky.
And this was in the Washington office?
This is in the Washington office, right, from 90 to 94.
Okay, and then?
And she was one of the very few women in Congress at the time. This was before the year of the woman in 92 that I started working with her, so it felt really special, too. Then I went to law school and decided, in fact, even at Nita Lowey's encouragement, that I wanted some graduate degree, so I went to NYU for law school. And then I clerked on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals for a Clinton appointee, Judge Martha Craig Daughtry, and a terrific judge. She sits in Tennessee on the Sixth Circuit, and tried being a real lawyer. From there, I went to the Justice Department into the honors program, and I practiced antitrust healthcare law. And
explain what the honors program is.
The honors program is the way that the Justice Department hires new attorneys out of clerkships and out of law school to start in the different divisions. And I went into the antitrust division because it was during the Microsoft trial when the Justice Department was suing Microsoft for antitrust violations. And so my theory was go where the action is. I wasn't on that case, but it was vigorous antitrust enforcement. And my theory all along in jobs and what I tell young people is go where the action is. So I wasn't an antitrust person, but I knew it would be an area of robust litigation and I could learn a lot. So I did antitrust healthcare work, hospital mergers and physician practice. I didn't love it, but I got good experience.
But how were you directed into healthcare, which obviously became a major part of your portfolio?
Yeah, I was accepted into the antitrust division and placed there.
Yeah. Okay. So you didn't necessarily have a predilection toward health?
No, I worked for Nita Lowey. I had worked on women's issues and reproductive health issues, and so that was a passion of mine. But I was really going in saying, I want to try being a real lawyer. I'm going to get this credential and see what I like being a DOJ lawyer. Mm-hmm. And I lasted about a year and a half. I didn't love it, and I would have stayed longer, but I got a call from the White House, from the Clinton administration, saying there's an opening on the Domestic Policy Council. Was I interested? And it was a fortunate situation. My old boss from Nita Lowey's office had recommended me for a position. So to me, in politics, you never can sort of plan a straight trajectory. This came out of the blue, and I, of course, jumped on it and went to work at the White House on the Domestic Policy Council. And so I did children and family policy for President Clinton. But as people now understand, have a better sense of, in the Clinton White House, Hillary Clinton, the First Lady, also had staff. And sometimes they were part of the president's staff, but also reported to her. And so I was a sort of dual reportee. I worked for the president on the Domestic Policy Council and was a senior policy advisor to the First Lady, and worked with her. So that was a very, obviously, exciting job.
Now, the timing of this, how does the timing of this coincide or not coincide with the Clinton impeachment?
It's after that.
Oh, okay.
I missed all of that, so I was there. I was actually more interesting. I was there when she was running for the Senate, and so that was interesting to see the lead up to that and her running for the Senate. And of course, I was in a governmental job, but to be on the inside when that was happening was very interesting too.
Well, she subsequently won her Senate bid. Why didn't you go to work for her?
I thought about it, but I actually had this great, I made this great connection to Senator Corzine. I had worked on children's mental health issues with the head of the NYU Child Study Center. And it turned out John Corzine was on the board and of the NYU Child Study Center. So at the end of the administration...
This is at the time when he was still the chair of Goldman Sachs?
Yes.
Okay.
He was interested in children's mental health issues. And so the head of the Child Study Center said, what are you doing next? And we were sharing stories, and it was... and he said, you ought to work for John Corzine. He's really amazing. And I thought, yeah, he seems great. I've watched his campaign, but I don't have any connection. And he said, oh, well, he's on my board. And the next day I had breakfast with John and Tom Shea, and we went from there.
The rest is history, as they say.
Right.
Well, let's go into that history a little bit. So this is 2000. Mm-hmm. He's running for the U.S. Senate. He's a novice. A man that I worked for, Jim Florio, was his opponent in the primary. Jim speaks frequently about how he was outspent by $35 million to $1 million or something like that. Corzine really jumped into this political world with both feet.
Right.
Were you involved in the campaign, or
no? I mean, so I came in after that.
He was elected.
But I sort of inherited as a staffer. He had an ambitious campaign with a very progressive agenda, right? And he had run on, you probably remember, sort of universal health care, universal child care. He'd run on very ambitious proposals. So then,
and a very progressive agenda.
So we were then sort of, okay, what are we going to do about this now? And at the time, the Senate was 50-50. So it wasn't necessarily the climate, and of course, Bush had won the presidency. So it wasn't the time to be able to do a lot of progressive legislating. But you could lay down markers. And what I found was that he was very driven by what was going on in New Jersey. The first bill that I wrote for him was a bill to ban racial profiling. And that was really a reaction to what had been happening in New Jersey with racial profiling in the state police.
The state police was a major issue at the time.
So that, and I think that was something he cared very deeply about. And one through line, I think, for him has been social justice and particularly racial justice. So that, came together there. But another bill, we wrote a universal health care bill. So this is now 8 years before Obamacare. Mm-hmm. He was talking about universal health care, but it was tougher times given the makeup of the Senate. Yeah.
Sure. Now, what was your position at that point?
So I started as his counsel, and then became deputy chief of staff, and then eventually chief of staff, as you said. Yeah.
Now, let's talk about the timetable of that. You were deputy chief of staff. Tom Shea was the chief of staff. Who then subsequently became the chief of staff when Corzine became governor.
That's right.
So, did you step in as chief of staff when Shea left to be on the campaign? Is that how?
That's right.
That
exactly.
was the time
when Tom, yeah. So I followed Tom, and then he moved into the political realm. Well, he also left to go. John Corzine ran the DSCC, the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, in 2004, which was the campaign arm of the Senate Democrats. And Tom went over to run that. So even before Corzine ran for governor, he was doing the national political work supporting Democratic candidates. Which goes back to your point, is that sort of John jumped in with gusto, I think. I mean, within 4 years of being elected to the Senate, he was running the campaign arm of the Senate. And was actively involved trying to help other senators and elect a Democratic majority.
Was that perhaps a tribute to his ability to raise and spend money?
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. No, and he would say that too, right? And that he knew a lot of people and was a good fundraiser. And even though I don't know that he necessarily enjoyed it, but I think he was good at it. And that was a way to help the party. If you have a progressive agenda, you need a progressive majority. So,
how did he make the transition from being the chief executive officer of a Fortune 500, a major financial institution, to being essentially a backbencher in a body of 100 senators?
So, in retrospect, it wasn't surprising that he ran for governor, right? That maybe the Senate I think he cares deeply about issues, so there was a connection there. But he's not a pontificator, and I think he's a doer. So, he really jumped in. For example, 9/11 obviously happened when he was in the Senate, and we had so many people from New Jersey who perished. And I just remember how much he jumped into the casework of working with families. He really was a doer. And so I don't think his favorite part of the job was going down to the floor and pontificating at length. He really wanted to do. So in retrospect, it makes sense. Now, he never complained. We would note that he was the last person on the dais on the banking committee. But obviously an expert in all of those issues. And he never complained, but you always wondered, when Hank Paulson, or when the chairman of the Federal Reserve or the secretary of the Treasury is coming before the banking committee, you're the last person asking a question as they go down the line. And he never complained, but I always wondered that surely that was frustrating.
Some of his colleagues, who presumably did not have that same level of experience, must have shown some, if not deference to him, at least some interest in what he thought about these
Absolutely.
issues.
And he actually became very close with Chris Dodd, who was the chairman or the ranking member of the banking committee, and they worked together on a lot of things, and often he would defer to him. But there is just, the Senate is a hierarchical, based on how many years of service you've gotten, it's, body. It is what it is. And, it helped that he is self-effacing and is very generous as a person at sharing credit. And I think, so unlike maybe, not all politicians are like that. So he certainly got along well with people, but I think he did want to be a doer and not just not just the talker.
At what point do you think he began to entertain the idea of running for governor?
Oh gosh, I don't know that I could pinpoint that.
Do you think it was always in the back of his mind, or do you think it was something that developed because he was now in the legislative branch and recognized that he could be more of a doer in the executive?
I don't know, because I think he thought, like going into the 2004 election, for example, we hoped that Kerry would win the presidential, and then there would be different opportunities if there were Senate majority to either legislate or Secretary of Treasury, right? I mean, I think there was always, how do I be more active and how do I contribute? But I don't know about the governor. Not being at that point, not being a New Jerseyan. I mean, now I've totally gone over to the Garden State. I might not have been the first to have been noticing it because I wasn't playing things out in the same way our political staff would have been. But yeah. So,
do you think that one of the reasons that he may have chosen to run for governor, in addition to the fact that he wanted to, as you say, be a doer, was the sort of dysfunctional activities that had taken place in the early 2000s in terms of New Jersey's governorship? Jim McGreevey had been elected, had resigned. The Senate president, Dick Cody, now became both the Senate president and the governor because we didn't have a lieutenant governor at the time. It was sort of presumed that there would be kind of a wide open race for governor in 2005.
So I think that's the political opportunity, but I think underlying that was this sense of federalism and the excitement about opportunities at the state level, right, of what you can do as governor, and in particular as governor of New Jersey, right, as we understand how powerful the governor is in New Jersey in terms of how much you can do. So I think it was...
When you have money.
Well, I mean, that's true. We can talk about that, how it's harder. But, when you're in a Senate that's 50-50 and you're gridlocked and you've voted against the war, the President Bush has been reelected despite what you've done to, hopefully to elect your ally. That's frustrating, right? And so the opportunity to be at a state level where you have levers to a power to do things, and hopefully we'll get to those, to really accomplish things, it's interesting. And I myself have lived this now of having worked in the House and Senate and have thought those were the greatest jobs, and then being convinced, wait a second, in this federal system, the action is really in state capitals, and there's so much you can do.
Well, let's talk about what you can do, or what you did. 2005, he is elected as governor. There is a transition now from one Democratic more or less incumbent, an acting governor,
Right.
to another Democrat. That hasn't happened since, if I'm not mistaken, 1961, when one Democrat, when a governor of the same party succeeded another governor. So you got a different situation in terms of the transition than you normally would. How involved were you in all of that activity?
So I was involved in we had committees, gosh, we call them committees for each department that did transition reports. And so I was involved in those. And they did pretty ambitious reports for each department and probably overdid them. It was a very thoughtful approach. And that's certainly a lesson that Corzine is very substantive and cared about each department. He wanted to know each department, what the status quo, what the budget, what were the priorities, what were the opportunities. There was a real focus. So we were involved in helping the departments transition and sort of trying to understand what was happening in the department. So I was less involved in the personnel, where I think that was more, especially since I was newer to New Jersey at the time. But it was a very thoughtful and thorough, even to your point, interestingly, policy and substantive transition, even though it was a D to D transition, there was a sense of, okay, what is our agenda going forward? Not just continue the status quo.
And there was a new team of people coming in, regardless of the circumstance, who may not have been as familiar with the workings of state government as some of the folks who were there. So that kind of transition always takes place in terms of policy papers being prepared, and groups of transition people in different experts in different subject areas, looking into what are the issues, what do we have to deal with, what are the policy priorities, and then preparing for the incoming governor, laying out what we think is going to.
Right.
Where were you specifically on the health panel for
No,
for this?
I mean we were involved. Some of the Senate staff, several of the Senate staff from Washington moved up to New Jersey, and so we were working on helping. It was in the top floor of the old hotel on State Street. The top floor of that building. That's which is an old hotel. Do you know that building?
I'm trying to remember.
It's Calhoun and State Street.
Yeah, it started as a Holiday Inn.
Yes, exactly. It'd been a Holiday Inn, and then right. So we had that top floor, and so there was that focus on how do we start, empower all of the departments to be active. I mean, he's an activist, right? I mean, I think that was there. I mean, but you raised something interesting there that I hadn't thought about it exactly this way, which is that the transitions are new people coming in. He had several kinds of new people, right? So he had some of us coming from the Senate. He had some sort of the long-standing Democrats involved in government in New Jersey, some holdovers.
And he also had
the Goldman people, right. So that was an interesting, sort of mix to bring those in. So as treasurer, Brad Abelow, Gary Rose was down the hall from me, running the Office of Economic Growth. So there were, so you had different influences, which, I think was really interesting.
What he set up, Tom Shea was the chief of staff. Then there were 2 or 3 deputy chiefs, I guess Maggie Moran and
Janine LaRue and Patty McGuire.
So
Maggie, Cabinet Affairs and Operations, Patty McGuire, Legislative Relations, right, and Janine, Constituents and Outreach. But, that doesn't do any of them justice, obviously, but that's roughly how. And then there was a press office.
Right.
Yvette Mendez Anthony Coley, ran it first. Yvette was communications director and Anthony Coley was press secretary.
Right. Okay.
And then I oversaw the policy shop. We had between 6 or 8 people, and I had a deputy, Julie Cashin, who had been the legislative director in the Senate office.
That's a fairly small policy staff by comparison. Previous administrations had an Office of Policy and Planning with different people sort of responsible for being kind of the governor's office liaison to different cabinet positions.
Well, a couple things happened. One, some functions were taken over. So if you had Gary Rose doing economic growth, you had that taken care of itself, sort of. And there were cabinet affairs staff whom we worked closely with. And in fact, we would have a daily meeting, and Cabinet Affairs would attend that meeting. So and I should have mentioned also we had the Washington office under us. I mean, it was just one person running it, but we would have a daily meeting / call. He would call in, Rick Kessler, and it would be what's going on at the day. And so we worked closely because so much of the policy is done, as you mentioned, through the agencies. I mean, it quickly became clear that given the financial situation, we were going to have to find ways to do things to achieve policy goals that weren't going to cost anything, and that's always hard. It's easier to spend money to expand programs, to stand up new programs. It's a lot harder to do things that don't cost money.
Well, and in fact, upon taking office, Governor Corzine faced an enormous budget deficit, and the likes of which had never been seen before. We're talking about several $1 billion, not several million or 100 million. Right. And he had to take some fairly drastic action. How, from a policy perspective, did you feel as though you were like totally hamstrung in terms of what you could do in those first 6 months or so about doing any major policy initiatives while there was so much uncertainty about the finances?
Fortunately, no. I mean, I think what we would do is we immediately started doing what are called fish bowls. I don't know if you know that term, and maybe you did something similar, but just called it something different. Is the treasurer would bring in each department, usually the commissioner and the key staff, including the budget staff, and policy sat in that, and you would go through the budgets for each department, right? In a normal year, that starts in the fall, where you're working towards the governor proposes a budget in the winter, and
but not the year that you've been
not
elected.
that when you come in January and you inherit a batch. So we were sort of on hair on fire doing it then, right? But within each department, we were trying to think about positive initiatives, and we actually, even within a really bad budget year, had a pot of funding that we were sort of trying to carve out for initiatives. So there are a couple that sort of come to mind. One, there was an expansion of after-school care. There was a real focus, and this is some of them. There was a focus on kids in with special education needs, particularly autism, because there had been this increasing growth in the number of kids being diagnosed with autism, and you may know this, New Jersey has the highest rate in the country. Mm-hmm. So as some issues sort of came to prominence, we were able to say, look, we need to do this. And interestingly, another one that I think is important to note is we increased family planning funding. So that $7.5 million that people are sort of familiar with because Governor Christie line item vetoed that's funding, and then Governor Murphy this year restored it. We actually had increased it to $7.5 million in that first budget because that was one of Governor Corzine's priorities. It had been lower than that. So there were small, I don't remember what the increase was, but it was 7.5 total. So it was maybe a couple $1 million. So these were small, but we considered them down payments on broader, sort of, okay, early childhood education is going to be a priority. We know education is a big priority. We were obviously, signaling we were going to obviously get to redoing the school funding formula. Women's health was a priority.
Well, you were under a court mandate to do that.
We were, but so had governors been.
Every other governor since.
Right. If it were that easy, why had no one done it before, right? I mean, I think that sometimes we have to remind ourselves that redoing the school funding formula was a Herculean task. We had staff detailed from agencies coming over to help to do run. I mean, it was. The Department of Community Affairs was engaged because there's such a municipal impact to school aid. Mm-hmm. Lucille Davey was the education commissioner and did a tremendous job. And Jan Ellen Duffy in the governor's office was the education staffer in the policy office. But that was an all hands on deck. I mean, and throughout the process, actually, we also had the AG's office, the DAGs, and there were deputy attorney generals, right? Is that,
deputy attorneys general.
Attorneys, right. Were part of the process. But that first budget was really, where can you find savings? And even those were small. I mean, I still remember Department of Transportation, one saving was going to be that the state was no longer going to pick up deer carcasses on state roads, that would have to be the responsibility of the municipality.
Which, as I recall, that was proposed, by the way, several years earlier, numerous times, and Senator Littell from Sussex County was always there to make sure that there was enough money put back into the budget for deer carcasses to be removed.
That was a big issue in the more rural parts of the state. Mm-hmm. And it was probably only a couple $1 million anyway. It wasn't a lot of money, but literally you're trying to find anything that you can cut. I mean, we got very involved in the budget and thinking about hospital funding. Hospital funding is a large, it's discretionary, but politically very important part of the state budget. At the time, it was about $650 million in charity care funding. And we proposed what became known as a bed tax. I don't know if you remember that, but
I do.
It often what happens in healthcare is you're trying to maximize federal revenue coming in, right? Healthcare is second only to education in state budgets, and it's an opportunity. There's a lot of federal money that comes in, and you're always trying to find ways to maximize that federal revenue. And so we had what we thought was this great idea that will increase this tax on hospital beds. And then when you bring in the money, you get federal match, and so you actually get more money. But guess what? To do that, you have winner and loser hospitals, and we learned very quickly that how hard that is.
And I should point out, at the same time, you faced a situation where clearly the legislature, even though it was also in the hands of Democrats, was testing the new governor.
Right.
And there was a definite. I mean, you had a shutdown. You had a shutdown at the end of that first budget year, which was the first in New Jersey history. It lasted several days, and largely attributable, at least looking back on the clippings of the time, to the fact that there was the governor and the legislative leadership were at loggerheads about who was really going to call the shots about this thing.
That's right, and I think and he was new to Trenton, right? He was not a creature of Trenton, and was he going to be able to navigate Trenton? And and he did, but they obviously thought they smelled blood and thought they could roll him, and I think if somebody's watching this, I would recommend they watch. Eagleton recently did a fascinating forum on Governor Corzine's first budget, and one of the key takeaways for me was how smartly he did handle it. And it was really tough, and it was not a foreordained conclusion that he was going to win that fight, but it was sort of the combination of sticking to his principles. He was very clear. I remember those, he would go every day during the shutdown, and even before the shutdown, he was clear about saying we have a fiscal crisis. We can't kick the can down the road. I think it was his messaging was clear.
I believe he talked about the fiscal crisis in his inaugural address.
Yeah, he had laid the groundwork, and he had this kick the can down the road, which became annoying after hearing it 1,000th time, but it was really an apt metaphor. We got to stop kicking the can down the road. And then I think Tom Shea and Maggie and Patty McGuire deserve a lot of credit for how they handled the shutdown, in the sense of some of it was optics, the rolling in the cot.
Did you sleep at the State House?
I didn't sleep at the State House, but I was there for about 20 hours each day, and so I still have pictures, and my son was 3 at the time, has vague memories of being brought to visit me because I didn't see him for a couple days. Yeah, it was intense, and it was ugly. It got ugly.
The bed tax was one of the things that bit the dust in that.
I still have a button, no bed tax. And so that was tough. So but I think it was that combination of sticking to his gun, sticking to his principles and the messaging, and then obviously a very smart, and this is where Tom, Maggie, and Patty deserve credit, a very smart political strategy that if folks are interested, I would definitely encourage you to watch that, because it was really interesting to hear. I think you were there to hear about all the strategies that went into aligning with the Assembly Republicans, the use of intermediaries. I think even reflecting now on the fact that the governor's office has moved down the street because the Capitol is under construction, the fact that we were in the Capitol and people were in and out, the nature of the governor's office, you probably remember, is in and out, and a lot happens informally. And I think the current administration is missing that by having to be down the street. It's just, there's a barrier.
I'm sure. I even remember during the first couple of years, I guess, of the Florio administration, when the Assembly and Senate chambers were under renovation, and they were meeting in different locations.
Oh, same thing.
And that made it difficult to have that informality that you're talking about.
Even though I would say, at the staff level, I also, Patty and I met weekly with Bill Kastner and Kathy Crotty, and you, I'm sure, remember Kathy Crotty, who was the Senate Majority Staff leader, and Bill at the time was the Assembly Staff leader. We talked about policy, bills coming up. At the staff level, a lot of things moved, and I think when we look back, a lot was accomplished, but you're right. This was happening at sort of the meta level, this testing at that first budget of who's, and if he had not succeeded there, we knew that he would really be hobbled for the rest of his term.
Now, in addition to a legislature governor conflict there, it seemed that there was also a fairly significant North versus South.
Yeah.
Particularly when it came to taxation. That what kinds of taxes the legislature was going to embrace or not seemed to depend entirely upon whether it seemed to benefit North Jersey or South Jersey. Did you get a sense that that was?
Yeah, I mean, I had a real political education in the politics and regions of New Jersey, and I live in Princeton, so I feel like I'm not of the North or the South, but I really, and in fact, I still remember we lived through the Yankees-Phillies World Series, and it felt like Princeton was the dividing line. People were, of where fans were. But yes, there was quite an education about that. Now, fortunately, we had pretty skilled people in the Tom Shea and Maggie and Patty and Janine, pretty skilled political people who could read those. But yes, I had to get up to speed on that and understanding, and that even later on in my job as Commissioner of Health and Senior Services, you always had to be aware of that North-South dynamic.
I would think
present.
I don't want to jump ahead to your position in Health and Senior Services, but it seems to me that going from policy staff, to administrator of an agency, you necessarily had to become more political or understand the political dynamics more.
That's right. So as policy staff, you're a little bit insulated, and you get to then, we were having daily staff meetings, so you hear that, and you're trying to think about how it affects what you're doing. But, it comes up even in the context of, okay, he should do an event about X issue. And where are you going to do it? Who are you working with? Those kind of issues you get pulled into. And who's going to be up there with him? So, yes, I mean...
But as the chief policy advisor, that's not your bailiwick.
No, I mean, so I'm saying, well, we could do this, and we could highlight this, and then maybe you're asking somebody to do a run and say, well, find a school district that benefits. Other people are usually putting political parameters on. Yeah, I think that's right. You're operating within political parameters that other people are setting. And again, I have to say, Governor Corzine, I never felt the political pressure from him on any of this stuff. I mean, I think he really cared about the issues. I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about that. Maybe
I guess that's actually a good transition. Let's talk a little bit about his management style. How engaged was he in these kinds of conversations that you're describing now?
So we had frequent we had daily staff meetings, and he often came to staff meetings. He's pretty engaged. I mean, he's pretty substantive, wants to read stuff. I remember from my time on the Hill, some people would have bosses who would tell them they never wanted to see a briefing memo that was longer than a page, right? And
I believe we have a president.
Yes, exactly. But he was not. I mean, maybe he's not the out. But Corzine is very substantive and would want to know and wanted to be thorough, right? So he, as his management style, so he cared about the details and usually cared about the outcome. I mean, I think back to, I'll give you an example. When we'd been in the Senate, the Medicare Part D, which is the prescription drug benefit, that bill had come through Congress and had been enacted. He had voted against it because we thought it might not be good for New Jersey, and the majority of Democrats voted against it. So the history, sort of on the record, was that he had opposed it. Then he becomes governor, and actually, enough time has lagged that it's actually being implemented. So we got to see both sides of it. And I still remember when it first went live, there were a lot of problems. Not nearly as many as healthcare.gov, but it's interesting to analogize. There were a lot of problems with implementation. People's cards weren't working at pharmacies. They weren't getting coverage.
That's still happening, by the way. But
so we haven't figured it out totally. But Secretary Leavitt, the former governor of Utah, who was Secretary of HHS, was going around, was trying to solve problems and putting out fires, and he came to Trenton to meet with Governor Corzine. And I still remember Governor Corzine saying, well, what do we need to do to fix this? And us even working with the feds and saying, okay, we'll cover the cost of the prescriptions, we the state, if you'll make us whole at the end, right? We had this agreement that on the back end, we'd be reimbursed by the feds, but because it wasn't coming through from the feds, we didn't want people at the point of seniors at the point of purchase in pharmacies to not be able to fill the prescriptions, and we stepped in to do that with state dollars on the promise that the feds would repay that. I look back and think, gosh, I don't think that would happen now with a lot of people. And some of that was testament to him that he didn't go out and do a press conference and say, see, this law that I voted against and this administration whom I don't support can't implement a benefit and seniors are getting hurt. Instead, actually, I think we did a press event with Levitt and talked about how we were going to work together to make sure seniors were protected. So to me, that was a good example of where he wasn't grandstanding and it was how do I get it done. And he was pretty engaged in, okay, let's get Department of Health over here. That was when I was in the governor's office. Like, how are we going to make this happen? So yeah, I would say pretty engaged. I mean, he also, there are a couple other issues where I got to see really how much he cared. I mean, another one was the death penalty. Another one that's probably not a big political winner in the state, eliminating the death penalty. Governor Cody deserves credit. He had you may recall, set up a commission to study it and sort of set in motion the process of reconsidering the death penalty in New Jersey.
And they came back with a very, very strongly worded
They did. And I think, the right people on the commission, thinking about it in the right way. Reverend Howard, I think, chaired that commission. But then when it came time to work legislatively, Corzine was all in. And maybe now, again, I think when you look back, it doesn't seem as big a deal. But New Jersey was the first state to abolish the death penalty in a while, and then there's been a wave since then, and New Jersey was really the leading edge. So, and not many governors would have gone on a limb for that, I think. Another example I would put in that category was paid family leave, right? So we have the federal law, Family Medical Leave Act, which provides people with the ability to come back to their job after they've taken leave for a child or an elder or caregiving responsibilities, but you don't get any of your wages, right? It's unpaid. So that's a real problem for people who aren't of any means. So we were only the second state to enact a state-level paid family leave act. And so that was also done in those first 2 years, which again, to me, that was the benefit, and that was a through line back to his time in the Senate of focusing on progressive issues. And then, again, we wish we could amend the Family Medical Leave Act at the federal level and make it paid family leave. That's not happening anytime soon. But you can do it at the state level, which you can't do at the federal. And both the death penalty and paid family leave are examples of that.
There were a couple of other sort of health-related issues that came up in the first couple of years of the administration when you were still in your policy position. One was the scandal involving the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, that had been going on even before we came in, but then it really heated up. And I think Governor Corzine, one of the things he did, so for your listeners, your viewers.
And your viewers.
Yeah, there had been corruption at the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey, which some people will not even remember because it's been dissolved actually. Right. And its component parts absorbed into Rutgers and Rowan and the New Jersey Medical School in Newark. But at the time, there was pretty widespread corruption at UMDNJ, and in terms of the contracts being given and the staff. And what Corzine did that was so important is that he appointed Bob Del Tufo, who had been the state attorney general, right. As you know, for Florio, right? To your point that things keep coming around, appointed him to be to chair the board. There had been a monitor imposed by the U.S. Attorney, Chris Christie, but he appointed an aggressive new chairman of the board to say we're going to clean it up. And that was really important to send that signal. So I think really helped right the ship. And then I think Governor Christie deserves credit for taking it to the next level, which is maybe realigning the assets in the state. But that could not have happened if they had not righted the ship. And
were you heavily involved in that discussion because of your background in health?
No, that was really handled, because it wasn't really about health policy. Oh, okay. It was Stuart Rabner, who was then the chief counsel, and then, of course, later Attorney General and now Supreme Court Justice Stuart Rabner was handling it. That was very much about ethics. I did, though, as Commissioner of Health, I did sit on the board, and so I got to see it from that perspective. Sure. Then. When I was the governor's representative, the Commissioner of Health has a seat. So, yes. But then, I would say ethics I was less involved in, but I certainly observed because there was clearly a whole new ethos of ethics that Governor Corzine infused into his administration, and sort of the high symbolism of hiring Stuart Rabner as his chief counsel was not lost on all of us, and that and every staff meeting you had, Stuart Rabner is sitting there as you're talking about these issues.
Mm-hmm. The another sort of health-related issue that arose was the decision to sever the Division of Youth and Family Services from the Department of Human Services and make it its own agency. Were you involved in that?
So what was known as DIFUS at the time was part of the Department of Human Services, which is the largest state agency. And we had also been under court order. Sadly, I mean, for how the abuse and neglect and protection of children in New Jersey was being handled by the state. There had been some very high-profile tragedies of kids dying in state custody. And so we were under a court order, and we had to monitor advocates for children, children's rights lawyers in New York who were outside monitors. But and maybe this goes to Corzine's management style. He said, we have to, I remember distinctly, we have to cleave this off, Department of Human Services. Department of Human Services has so many responsibilities. It is so large. The commissioner, and he had actually appointed as commissioner Kevin Ryan, who had been the child advocate. And he said, so Kevin is the perfect person to be fixing this, but he's running so many divisions, running such a large department. It just can't happen from a management perspective that we're really going to fix this. And we need to cleave it off and create a new department. So working with Kevin Ryan, and Kevin actually became the commissioner, we created the Department of Children and Families. And I still remember before the press conference talking to Kevin, and what are we going to say? And we decided we're going to say failure is impossible. Like, this is the core function of government, we have to get it right. But it really goes back to Corzine saying, from a management perspective, if you don't focus on the issue, you can't solve it. And it being buried in a larger department was going to prevent us from ever really getting our hands around it.
I'm wondering if you can imagine what it was like before the Department of Human Services was created. It was the Department of Institutions and Agencies, which was Human Services and DIFUS and the Department of Corrections, all as part of one department. Can you imagine trying to run that?
No, exactly. And so it just means you're dealing with putting out fires and you're not really dealing with the core issues. So yeah, that is quite something. I think the progress we've made now, which continued on our child welfare system, is something we should be really proud of.
There are two other failed initiatives. One was an attempt to get state workers to pay more toward their health care, which was subsequently repealed. The other was a bond issue to raise a significant amount of money for stem cell research that was turned down by the voters. You must have been involved in those two
Especially in the stem cell initiative, and that was really painful because the stem cell research was something that was near and dear to Governor Corzine's heart. It had a lot of political support. There was a lot of emotional support behind it, but I think...
And there had been a small appropriation.
There had been funding that Governor Cody had started that we had continued for research at Rutgers, and we had some very prominent and really brave advocates in New Jersey, and it was something that we felt that it was important on a human level to do this research, but also we thought it was an opportunity for New Jersey to be a leader from a bioscience perspective here, that if we could create the Stem Cell Institute here in New Brunswick, right here, that it could really help from an economic development perspective. I think what we didn't foresee, and it really foreshadowed, we ended up seeing later, was the backlash from people with taxes generally, I think, and concern about taxes generally. This was appeared to be another tax. So it's not that people didn't support stem cell research.
Although bond issues, by and large, pass in New Jersey. Well, most of them are for open space.
Yes. And I think this felt different to people, or maybe we didn't talk enough about. I mean, who knows? But was this the start of something coming, a backlash? I don't know. I mean, yes, that hurt because it felt like both that it was going to stall progress on the research, but also it was this missed opportunity for New Jersey to be a leader. But in all this, you asked again to take it back to the leadership style. I think one thing that makes Governor Corzine really special is, I think, his connection to people. And I'm reminded, Tricia Riccio was one of the advocates. She had a son who was paralyzed and was one of the advocates. And he really connects well with people. And I'm thinking also about, as we mentioned earlier, the 9/11. How many of the 9/11 people who lost family members, and the connection he felt to them and that they felt to him, because of that personal connection he has. And you don't necessarily see that when you're seeing him giving a speech. You don't see that personal quality that he has. And that's certainly why I liked working for him. I mean, when I moved up here, I was not from New Jersey, but he convinced me, come to New Jersey, we're going to do great things. There are actions at the state level. And again, I was a little bit of a, I was a Fed person. I had worked at the federal level. I wasn't sure, how was I going to feel about this? But that personal style and that connection, I think, is what drew me, is that I had confidence. I knew he was going to want to do the right thing, and he was going to work hard, and he was going to be a good boss.
Well, in April of 2007, all of that almost came to an end. Governor Corzine was involved in a very serious traffic accident. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt. He was going 90, his trooper was driving him at 90 miles an hour, and he ended up in critical condition. Subsequently, over a period of 2 or 3 months, had a very, very slow recovery. How did government function? How did the central office function in those 2 or 3 months?
Gosh, I mean, it was really hard. I was at Drumthwacket that night. He was coming back. He was supposed to be having a meeting, and he was running late for the meeting, which is, I think, why they were speeding there, for a meeting at Drumthwacket, the governor's residence, with Don Imus and the Rutgers women's basketball team. Right. So that sort of gets lost to people who weren't, living it. And Don Imus had said something offensive about the coach.
Cost him his job, as a
matter of fact. It did. He on the radio, and so Governor Corzine was going to host this meeting, and so I was there for the meeting, and we got word, and it was, we were all, it was very, very scary, and thank goodness for the great doctors at Cooper, and his recovery was miraculous, but I have to tell you, it was very hard. He was weak for a long time, and you can see that in the pictures when you look back. But to those of us who knew him, he's very robust. He's a big guy, sort of a bear of a guy, and he's a hugger and a high fiver, and he's a very physical person, and so he was very weak. He was on crutches for a while, but you could just tell he lost a significant amount of weight. He was weak for a while, and that was very painful to watch, obviously, and he'd lost that robustness, right? That energy that he had. Now, in those first couple weeks, we didn't have a lieutenant governor, right? So
right.
We've corrected for that problem because there was some confusion. I think Tom Shea, chief of staff, we all, it was all hands on deck, and luckily we were all rowing in the same direction, but of course nobody knew what was going on. For a while we knew his condition was serious, but we didn't know how serious, and we were trying to protect, I think they were trying to protect the family, of course, but so how you talk about it versus what, how much you're willing to say publicly when the family is going through this horrible process of everybody's on pins and needles. So it was hard. Having Governor Cody as Senate President be able to step in was great because he had done it before. And
did he become acting governor during that period?
No,
formally? I don't actually recall whether
yes, it's not looking at Chris. He did, and I don't know for how many days, but I remember dealing with him. I'm trying to remember what the issue was, but he did. So we had somebody, and at least he knew. He knew the drill. The staff, he knew us, we knew him, we knew his staff. So, it was as seamless as it could have been. And I'm confident we didn't drop any balls, but we were, it was a harrowing time. It was really tough. And I'm glad we have a lieutenant governor in statute now, because you wouldn't want to go through it again.
So,
but even him coming back, it really was, even when he came back, it took him a while to get back to, he was weak, and it was hard, and he's the hardest working person I've ever worked for, and you could still see how much it affected him.
Sometime later that same year, the Commissioner of Health resigned. Did you go to the governor and say, I'd like to be Commissioner of Health, or did he come to you and say, I'd like to make you Commissioner of Health?
No, he asked me, and I was torn, because there's sort of this sense in Trenton that you want to be near the action and power, right? And be in the governor's office.
Yeah, but there's also a tradition in Trenton that you don't say no to the governor.
Yeah, that's true. And also, I think for me, the hesitancy was, there's the difference when you go from staff from being staff to being a principal.
Absolutely.
Right? It's different skills. What was it gonna, you have to go through a confirmation process. And you have to, right, it tests different skills. And do you want to be that person? And do you want to be away from the other stuff you like? We had just done the school funding formula, which was so exciting, but we obviously had high hopes for other things. I mean, as you didn't get into, and I wasn't that involved with the monetization, but there was going to be, with the budget in the background, there was a hope still, if we could ever sort of crack the nut there, that we could do more. But no, it was so clearly the right decision. It was exciting, and I think, he said, I want you there, I want somebody I trust, and I wanted to do it because I knew what a good governor he was, and that he would be a good governor to work for, and it was really exciting. I inherited a terrific staff. I brought in just a few people, but mainly inherited a terrific staff, and really, really, really enjoyed it. It was hard. It was hard in a totally different way. You had almost 2,000 employees, and you're riding the elevator and somebody stopping you and saying, I don't like my parking spot. You're dealing with the budget at the time was $3.7 billion, and so you're dealing with that sounds like a lot of money, but actually you're scrimping everywhere because of how tough the budget is. And then you've got the sort of some of the political issues like charity care funding, which is so important to so many hospitals, which are the largest employers in every legislative district. We had H1N1, which was the swine flu, which became H1N1. So you're dealing with a lot of different incoming in a way I couldn't have anticipated.
Well, I mean, this was your first and I guess only experience in your own executive capacity.
Right. It is different when you've got a large department, you have a certain number of direct reports, but you have a large department, and your goal is to move things along. Your goal is to implement the governor's agenda, but there's also so much of what the Department of Health and Senior Services do that is not political, is the work of cancer prevention, of licensing, inspecting
hospitals. In fact,
hospitals.
there's very little that the department does on a day-to-day basis that's political at all, right?
At one point we had an abortion clinic that failed inspections, and it was in the news. And Governor Corzine called me about it, and we had a conversation about how this clinic needed to meet inspection, that women needed to have services in a clean and healthy environment. And we talked about how that clinic, he didn't interfere. He said, do what you have to do. It was in the news, so he asked me about it, but he said, do what you need to do. And so you have to hold this clinic to the standards.
Well, so much of running any state agency is dealing with the crisis of the day, right?
Right. So there'll be a death in a nursing home, and what was going on at that nursing home, and had it met its inspection standards, right? A hospital. I mean, I would say sort of the biggest issue that we dealt with the entire time was hospital distress. During Governor Corzine's time, 9 hospitals closed. And as we've mentioned, hospitals are large employers. People want to have a hospital near them. There's a lot of research now that sometimes hospitals closing may mean you have better quality at the remaining hospitals because they see more volume. But we were dealing with it it started when I was in the governor's office. The hospital, Hoboken Hospital, which is where the governor lived, there was a lot of pressure on him to save the hospital. And, so there's the question of, do you bail out a hospital? What kind of hospitals do you bail out? So this is still when I was in the governor's office. We created a commission to look at the health of our hospitals, and we asked Uwe Reinhardt, who was a health economist at Princeton. You may know him. He sadly passed away last year, but a sort of world-renowned health economist at Princeton. And Governor Corzine called Shirley Tillman, the president of the university, and said, will you lend me Uwe Reinhardt to chair this commission? And we had this all-star commission that came up with criteria that basically analyzed the health of the healthcare industry and came up with criteria for when we should step in and save a hospital. And to me, that's another example, I think, of Governor Corzine's focus on policy there, because otherwise we were dealing with hospital closures from a crisis perspective. And that was too often political. Which hospital do you save? Rather than having a criteria of, this hospital is not an essential hospital, we shouldn't be investing scarce resources in propping it up. Instead, we should be making sure that people of the community have access to services, but it may not be a hospital, it may be a satellite emergency department. In Passaic County, they went from 5 hospitals to 2. So there was fewer hospitals, but also the 2 remaining hospitals were both Catholic hospitals. So what do you do then? Are women going to have the access to the full range of services if only too high? So, and so we actually gave a grant to Planned Parenthood to open up in Patterson to ensure there was access to reproductive health services that might not be available at the hospital, that the hospital was not going to provide. So it was trying to manage in a little bit of a smarter way. And
well, going back 20 or 30 years earlier, isn't this what the certificate of need process was supposed to be all about, to determine which hospitals needed which equipment or which services they were going to perform, so that it was all done on a more rational level?
Yes. So you understand. So some states have what's called certificate of need, which is when the state Department of Health decides when different healthcare services are available. So you might sort of open a new hospital or close a hospital. You need state permission to do so. Mm-hmm. The problem is that a lot of decisions get made even before certificate of need, whether or not how the charity care formula is designed, which hospitals benefit, and whether a hospital is starved or fed gets decided sometimes out of certificate of need. And also, Uwe Reinhardt said it well, we had half-hearted regulation. Our certificate of need didn't touch everything. Mm-hmm. So for example, if a hospital wants to have a cyber knife, you don't need the state's permission. So we had sort of this arms race of hospitals investing in very expensive equipment. And then what research has shown is that you buy a cyber knife, what do you then do? You use a cyber knife. and
whether it's needed or not.
Yes, it does. It drives utilization of services.
Right.
And so this is all predating Obamacare, where we've started to, fortunately, to rationalize, and that's the stuff I work on now. And I think in a way, we were anticipating some of that.
There was a more punitive law passed during this period, which required the state to name hospitals that had, let me see if I have the exact wording here, responsible for making certain categories of medical mistakes and prohibiting them from charging for preventable errors. It sounds like a pretty draconian step.
I think that was really about transparency, and that was something AARP was really involved in, was that you need to report to the public which hospitals have higher rates of errors, right? I mean, if you're literally operating on the wrong part of the body or you're leaving equipment in the body, those things were happening. And so that was part and parcel, I think, of a nationwide push to have more transparency. We also, a couple of other things we did, we improved governance at hospitals. We discovered, as I went around and talked to hospital execs and to boards of trustees, that often a hospital board is made up of, it's people have served for many, many years and don't have expertise in healthcare or finance. And so we required hospital trustees to go through training. Mm-hmm. And we also, something we did that I think didn't get enough credit, we also said that hospitals could not charge uninsured people more than what Medicare pays. Because the people who get hurt the most when they don't have health insurance and go to a hospital, the hospitals can charge them whatever they want, right? Mm-hmm. I have insurance. My insurance company is negotiating on behalf. But if you don't have health insurance, you can be charged anything. And we said, well, the hospital can't charge you more than a percentage of what Medicare pays. So these were all sort of things we were trying to patch a system that had a lot of flaws. Now, Obamacare has moved us ahead, but at the time we were doing what we could, yeah.
You also presided on the health department over a period of time when state aid to hospitals was sharply reduced. When, because of the budget crises, year after year, there were unpaid furloughs for state workers. There were significant concessions that were asked of state employees. And you had, as you said, a cohort of several thousand people working for you. What was morale like during that period in the agency that you were in?
So let me correct one thing. We actually did not cut charity care. It stayed stable when I was commissioner. Right, yeah. So, and that happened later after Obamacare came in. There was this sense that hospitals were doing better. You can cut charity care. But yes, we did cut. I think the staffing stuff doesn't get enough attention. I mean, staff had basically went for years without raises. And then we even stopped having coffee available sort of in the hall coffee station. I mean, it was just so severe, which I remember people saying, this is not fair. And so I would say morale was tough. I tried to visit every Department of Health, has its main building in Trenton, but then has satellite offices in nearby in Quaker Bridge and some up in Newark. And I tried to visit all of them to talk to people, and I heard it loud and clear. People frustrated with the fact that they had not gotten raises, and also that state employees were getting vilified. all the time. A little bit, like, here, look, I'm out inspecting child care centers, I'm inspecting nursing homes, and yet we're the bad guy. So that was hard. I mean, you feeling like you had to convey, I believe in you, we know you're doing good stuff. Governor Corzine, I actually asked Governor Corzine to come over to the department and talk to staff so he could convey his appreciation for them. And, you only have so many tools when you can't give people raises, but you try and recognize what people are going through.
Mm-hmm. How did you feel on November 4th, 2009?
Wow. I mean, I didn't see it coming, and maybe that was my fault, but that was a really, really hard night. Because it felt like we still have a lot more to do. And I think, and it was just 1 year into the Obama presidency, so it really felt like we finally had an opportunity to do more too. I mean, I think when I think back to what we would have done in my area, we would have been implementing the Affordable Care Act and being a leader or other areas. So the missed opportunities, but also for him feeling his pain, that was very, very painful.
I should go back to about a year earlier, in fact, when President Obama was elected and was the president-elect, and it was widely speculated that Governor Corzine was under consideration for the Treasury Secretaryship. I don't know, perhaps you do, whether it was offered to him and he didn't take it, or whether it was never offered to him.
I don't know, you'd have to ask him that, but that's an interesting,
Should he have taken the job?
I mean, it was in the middle of the financial crisis, right? So that would have been both exciting and really challenging. Think about that. They had just saved Detroit, but we're trying to turn it, and instead we ended up focusing, and I think there was a real focus on the stimulus. That you remember there was the
using the stimulus money in New Jersey to
smartly to really sort of re-jump the economy. Yeah, so there was a real focus on that. As I said, there was that 1 year overlap when Obama was president and Corzine was still governor, where we tried to do as many things as possible. And yes, definitely there was that money flowing out. Remember, you had to prove you had shovel-ready projects, and
One of which, as I recall, was the access to the Regents Corps tunnel.
Yeah, I went to that groundbreaking. I still remember that. But that goes way back. I mean, that goes back to Corzine's time in the Senate. He was on the committees that authorized transportation projects. So when the big transportation, I think it was called TLU, it's called ICE-T and TLU. Anyway, the big transportation bill goes through. He wanted to be on Environment and Public Works and Banking committee because they were the authorizing committee. And
Lautenberg was pushing it on transportation.
And Lautenberg too, right, of course. And Lautenberg he was on the Appropriations Committee perspective, and he was a great ally. I have stories there too, but anyway, that's good. He got language in the bill to fund the tunnel, and I remember there was a big issue when the bill was in conference and whether or not it was going to stay in the House. And we drove over to the House bill to find, I don't remember the guy's name, the committee chairman, who wouldn't return his calls because knew, I'm sure what it was about, right? He was getting calls from everybody. Where's my bridge? Where's my whatever? We drove over there so that he could find him in the members' dining room and buttonhole him to say, this is, this was not just, this is what I need for my constituents. This is critical to the Northeast region, to the U.S. economy. And he could make that point really well. And I still remember him getting it and him persuading the guy to keep it in the final bill and getting the authorization. And then, come time to the Senate. So that was that critical part of securing the federal contribution to what was going to be. It was going to take a lot of money going in, but you needed that core federal contribution, which of course now we don't have. So we've had two things happen. One, we had Governor Christie cancel it, so then delay now costs more, and now we've lost the federal contribution. So it's really, I remember being at that. At the opening, at the shovel and digging in the shovel, and we'd be opening in 2018 or 2019. Mm-hmm. So anybody watching, taking New Jersey Transit, it could be a very different world now in New Jersey Transit, unfortunately, yeah.
Sounds to me as though your heart is still very much into the broad areas of policy and not necessarily limited to healthcare.
I love the healthcare stuff. Now I'm on the faculty at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, and I teach classes about the implementation of the Affordable Care Act and state and local health policy. And so that is what, that's what I'm really passionate about. And I work with states. What's been great is I work with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is the largest healthcare foundation in the country, and they're based in New Jersey. And I work with other states, helping them implement health reform. So I still very much in that, but yes, I care about these broader issues because I've seen how they connect and have worked on them and seen the levers and have seen the ups and downs, right? And have seen the possibilities. And more recently, I've gotten engaged in gun violence research because I think that's a public health issue. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's still, yes, this all still excites me.
When you look back on the time that you spent with John Corzine, from the Senate all the way up through and including to the end of his governorship, what would you look back on and say were the greatest accomplishments, and what would you look at as the greatest disappointments?
Well, a couple things. One thing we haven't talked about is him creating a new generation of leaders, and maybe every governor says this, so it's not, and I think about all the Florio people who were contributing in so many ways, but when you look at Governor Corzine's record, you have Ann Milgram, you have Stuart Radner becoming Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and it's such a distinguished jurist, and you have Ann Milgram, who was the Attorney General after Stuart Radner, who is now going on and doing amazing things. She's writing textbooks about human trafficking, and she's at NYU Law School. And you have, I'm trying to think about the chief counsel. Oh, he's going to kill me! I can't remember his name. The chief counsel later on in the term, who is now working at the Soros Foundation in New York. You've got different people who've gone on to national positions. Obviously, Lisa at DEP. It went on Lisa Jackson was the DEP commissioner, and then went on to run the Environmental Protection Agency, and is now doing worldwide environmental work for Apple. And I think so that sort of sending people out in a way, every once in a while I'll see that and I'll say, hey, did you see so-and-so did something? Ann Milgram was on this podcast recently, and did you see that? And so I think sort of creating that new generation of leaders because of people he elevated and is exciting, is an exciting legacy. In terms of accomplishments, I think the school funding formula, clearly, figuring out how to redo the school funding formula in a way that was fairer and invested in the schools that really needed it, and reimagining where that need was. So those inner suburbs, just not just the 30 cities that had the highest rates of poverty, but a lot of those inner suburbs, ring suburbs that also had similar rates of poverty, where poverty had grown, and reinvesting and rejiggering the funding. That was both sort of substantively incredibly meaningful, but also politically, quite a victory in that sense. Because anytime you're doing anything with funding formulas, winners and losers, is very hard.
Especially in public education.
Especially in public education. So unless you have a ton of money to expand the pie, which we didn't, it's very hard. So that, and then I think this progressive agenda, some of which he was really ahead of the curve on, the death penalty and paid family leave, are examples. And as I mentioned, family planning. It's forgotten that actually it was his investment that brought family planning to the fore that then Governor Christie defunded. So those, I think, are some examples. In terms of disappointments, sort of the unfinished business of what we would have done and how we might have taken advantage of an Obama presidency in a second term. Obviously the budget fixes that have eluded every governor, and the core structural problem that we have in our state budget, and that is preventing us figuring out transportation and education and healthcare. So that is still lingering. But also I think I should say too that his legacy of running, especially after the period beforehand, the concerns about ethics in government, righting the ship and sending a strong message about the importance of ethics, very important.
Mm-hmm. What have you been doing since 2009?
So I've stayed in healthcare in the sense of course, what happened.
You mentioned the Woodrow Wilson School.
That's right. So I mentioned Woodrow Wilson School. I think it's important.
But you've been up to other things as well.
I have. But just sticking on that for a second. So in 2010, the Affordable Care Act is enacted. President Obama signs that into law. And so that's really my work has then been on helping implement. So that's 8.5 years ago now, but it's such a complex federal law. It's taken years to implement, and even now, I found it's surprisingly resilient, but not settled. one of the questions I always ask my students is, how do you judge when a social policy has become enmeshed in the social policy fabric? And it's not there yet. I mean, obviously, Medicare and Social Security, nobody would talk about repealing those. We're still talking about repealing and replacing the ACA, right? So that's what makes it so interesting to help states with. So I recently traveled to Virginia, and helping the state of Virginia is now implementing Medicaid expansion. New governor elected last year, same time as Governor Murphy in New Jersey, and he's implementing the Medicaid expansion and helping Virginia learn from other states. So I really love, and I go into a state capitol and I'm in a room with mismatched chairs, and a sign that says no free coffee, and I feel like I'm home, right? I'm back in state government, right? So some of that, I love being back in state government. I also got involved, as you know, because you're a constituent locally. I ran for the Princeton Council, which is the local governing body, and I actually ran first for the Princeton Borough Council. We used to have a donut hole of Princeton Borough, and then the donut was Princeton Township. So I was on the Borough Council, and then I was involved in the effort to consolidate the two municipalities. And
the first and only successful consolidation in New Jersey in 50-something years.
That's right. So we went from 566 municipalities to 565 municipalities. And now I serve on the governing body for the combined entity. We have about 30,000 people who live in town. This is my last term now. I'm not running again because it's been, and I'm a big believer in importance of new blood, but it's been a really exciting experience to see at the local level how this plays out. And I also felt it was important, I have a teenage son now, to convey to him the importance of civic contribution. And I guess, having been, like you said, having been a principal now, it's like, maybe I'll run. That's a new muscle I haven't flexed. What's it like to run? What's it like to be in a debate and have to answer questions about property taxes? There are no easy answers.
The only difference being that there are no Republican opponents in Princeton.
Right, but we have spirited primaries.
Yes, we do.
And, and I even remember saying to Corzine at one point, like, now I see why it's not so easy always to give the perfect answer. When I've said, wait, I wrote that out for you. Why didn't you say X? I see when you're up there. It's not so easy always. Yeah, I have more sympathy now.
Is there a fraternity or a sorority? I guess it would be both. A combined fraternity, sorority of either former health commissioners or cabinet officers or Corzine veterans,
yes,
of which you are a charter member?
All of the above. So first, there is an association of health commissioners, ASTO. So and I was a member when I was a commissioner. Now there's an alumni association, and I've gone to their events and I keep up with. It's really nice to know people and to be able to share stories and share war stories sometimes. And then the Corzine world is more informal, but yes, I mean, we stay in touch and you feel such a connection. It's like you've been in the trenches with people, right? And so we recently, Eagleton hosted the first event examining Governor Corzine's legacy and talking about that first budget, and so many cabinet members and staff came back, and that was really meaningful to be able to see people. But also, a number of us have stayed in touch with Governor Corzine, just in touch with him and that personal connection. So still see him sometimes. A lot of emails. Hey, did you see this? Does that remind you of that? Which is really nice. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What didn't I ask you that I should have?
Right. So what was Trenton like? I mean, it was I don't know. You're a great interviewer. I don't know. What do you think? What do you think? What is that? Hello. What do you think? You came in late, but what do you think? Anything else?
I started to tell stories about Corzine and Lavender.
Oh, well,
yes,
what I was thinking. Yes. I mean, I'll start now.
Yeah.
I mean, what I remember more is, so we, then Senator Corzine, we were in the hot zone when the anthrax letters were sent to Tom Daschle. Our office was. Mm-hmm. We shared the air vent system with Daschle's office. So we had to evacuate our office for 3 months when they were cleaning out those offices for anthrax, because we theoretically had been exposed when the letter had been opened. So we ended up at a staff level, we just shared offices with Torselli and his staff. So that was an amazing experience to see how very differently another office works, and how different a member is, and how different a senator is, and different staff. And everybody should have to do it because we worked really well. And I think to then Senator Corzine's credit, he got along with whoever the other senator was. That wasn't always the case.
It certainly wasn't.
In senator connections, and I think that is to his credit, that he works well with he worked well with others, and he was just great. But I have to say, working with, it really should be required of all Senate staffs, because from the same, from the two senators from the two states, because we were on top of each other, which breeds familiarity. And then it was, Bill's coming up, will you write the memo? I'll write the memo for the next one. We shared work. It was really collegial. I will say working with Longberg was really fun. He had great staff who were so savvy about how to talk about issues, how to, in a way that connected with people, and how to use press. I mean, this was before social media, showing my age, but I think presaging social media. I still remember when George W. Bush signed into law the Partial Birth Protection Act, an anti-abortion bill, and the bill signing, maybe you know where I'm going, this was President Bush signing it and 15 men behind him, all the sponsors of the bill, not a single woman in the picture. And I remember Senator Lautenberg blowing up that picture and going down to the floor and showing that. After the war, Corzine had voted against the war, and he agonized about that vote. I still remember even his speech, as he was sort of coming to that conclusion as he was writing his speech on longhand. But something that Senator Lautenberg did is he had posters, pictures of lives lost in the war that he had outside his office. And, he argued, we've gone to this war, we need to be thinking always about the people who are dying over there in a way that no other senator would do. Mm. Right? I mean, the way he talked about issues, he was such a fighter. It was fun. I mean, it was fun to see when they would interview judicial candidates, to see that interplay of picking candidates for New Jersey and the interplay and the different styles. So we really, in New Jersey, have been blessed with having some very interesting senators. And at the staff level, to be able to see that was interesting. But going back to Corzine, anybody who's visited Senator Corzine's office will remember that he didn't have pictures of himself up in the office. He had pictures of famous New Jerseyans, and that was a very conscious decision. Mm. And it was very interesting, because some of them were interesting, like, who knew Alfred Stieglitz was a New Jerseyan? Well, maybe you did. But, some of them there were the obvious suspects of Bruce Springsteen, but then there were the less obvious suspects, Norman Schwarzkopf and his father, who had been the superintendent of the state police during the Charles Lindbergh kidnapping. So, but also, the pictures were not of him with the Pope or whomever, right? It wasn't about him. It was about New Jersey. So that was just, I don't know how much that people who came to the office noticed that, but to me it was an important message.